Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the Mining Podcast. And today's guest is Greg Cochran, who's the MD of Aurora Energy Metals, an Australian-owned company focused on the exploration and development of Aurora Energy Metals Project in Oregon, the US. And the project hosts a defined uranium resource and its prospects for lithium as well. Greg is regarded as an international executive with over 30 years experience in general management and in senior commercial technical roles. With a background in mine engineering, he's operated as an managing director and CEO at that level for the last 15 years, working on projects in Africa, Australia, and Asia, in a broad spectrum of minerals, including uranium, potash, and other industrial minerals and base metals. And he's here today to tell us more about Aurora Energy Metals. Greg is also going to be speaking at the upcoming Mines and Money event in London, which is at the end of November. So to be sure to obviously reach out to him in person if you're attending the event. There's further information below or accompanying this podcast in the show notes. So please obviously get your tickets early. And obviously if you're there, feel free to introduce yourself to Greg. Obviously he's going to tell us a little bit more about what he's doing, but obviously feel free to reach out to him. So that's welcome Greg to the podcast. How you doing, Greg?
Good day, Rob. Great, thanks, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the podcast. Really looking forward to telling you the story about what we're up to at Aurora.
Yeah, and I appreciate obviously your time as well. So as we always start these off, wondering if you just give us an overview of a background about yourself, about your career. Obviously, I just gave a quick highlight there, but if you can just go in a little bit more depth about yourself as a person. So, and what I gather from obviously the audience that they like this introduction because they get to know the guest. So yeah, just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your career.
Yeah, okay, no, fine. I by the way, I jokingly refer to myself as a mongrel because I'm a Zambian-born, ex-South African, now Australian. Lived also in the UK as well, so pretty much a global citizen, I guess. You know, and also jokingly refer to myself as a lapsed mining engineer because the further you go up, I found in the chain, the less technical you become and the more focused you are on broader management and leadership, etc. So, but for me, that's always been the exciting part of the business. You know, I do love scratching below the surface and getting into the technical stuff, but also like to very importantly set the tone of the organization I'm leading, and then also the strategy. And a large part of my career was business development. And so there's always one eye on opportunities beyond the existing portfolio as well. And I've had a lot of fun doing that. In fact, one of the analysts I was talking to recently reminded me, because I ran the due diligence for the Eurasia transaction when I was with Uranium One back in 2007. And he said to me, you know, that is still the largest uranium transaction ever done. And I paused for a moment and is that true? And then I thought back to the timing and the quantum. It was over 3.2 or 3.8, I can't remember, Canadian billion dollars. And so, yeah, he was right. You know, it was a different time then, and who knows what the future holds when it comes to uranium. We do believe there will be a lot of consolidation because bigger companies generally do it better and are able to deliver. But that doesn't mean to say that the smaller companies can't get there as well. I'm being distracted into the minutiae of the industry. Coming back to me, as I said, a mining engineer by background. And funny, there have been these times in the past where almost just coincidentally I've been drawn into uranium. As early as when I was a student in South Africa, where the company I was with developed the first dedicated underground uranium mine, which later closed, which was a salutary lesson for me in terms of the economics of mining in general and uranium in particular. And then later on, a colleague of mine in that same company, 10, 12 years later, somewhat distraught, told me about the fact that the company had sold Langer Heinrich. And I'd never heard of Langer Heinrich. And I said, what is that? And he said, well, and you know, he almost, you know, like a fatherly figure said to me, almost with his pointing a finger at me, you know, mark my words, sonny boy, almost. nucleus time will come, and Langer will be one of the first of the new generation of uranium mines. And that's exactly what happened, so I never forgot those lessons. And I guess that's the story of my life, is as you get older and your career progresses, you want to make sure that you learn those lessons from the past in terms of the good and the bad, and you acknowledge, sometimes we don't get it right, and then sometimes you just hit it out of the park. And so that's what makes this life and this career in mining industry that much more exciting.
So you joined Aurora less than a year ago, and you're leading the company through the ASX listing process, and to advance obviously the US Uranium Lithium project. Just wondering, just tell us a little bit about the company, and also what attracted you to Aurora.
Sure. I think first of all, when I left my previous role, when I stepped away after Deep Yellow from uranium in late 2016, I felt, having nurtured that company and kept the lights on and done credible work for 5.5, 6 years, I was kind of in desperate need of a sabbatical from uranium, because things just were not turning around. So, left. And when I left Aurora Minerals last year, I thought, hang on a minute, and I had 2 years ago already been investing in uranium, thinking actually there is a revival underway, and so I'm happily I have a couple of 10 baggers locked away, so that's fantastic. So the timing was right, but there's nothing better than actually then getting directly involved in something that you can actually believe in, rather than just on an investment basis. And so I was actively looking in the space when I was approached by the people from Mitchell River Group who stand behind us, and they're a very smart group of people with similar values to me. So really nice group of people who have been there and done that before when it comes to project delivery. So they don't just talk their game and mind the market. They actually have on their track record that they've delivered mines in multiple jurisdictions in different commodities, and that really appealed to me. So they said to me, look, you've got this uranium profile and background. Here's something different, uranium plus lithium. Are you interested? And when reflecting on the structural change that's going on in the global economy about how we produce energy today and into the future, this is a compelling message. It was just, you're kidding me. A well-defined uranium resource with lithium on top, where do I sign up? So it ticked all those boxes, and so I had numerous other opportunities, but this was the one that I decided to focus on. And when I came on board in December last year, we fast-tracked the listing, recognizing that things in the global markets can change very rapidly, and we've seen that happen, partially as a result to, I guess, the back end of COVID and the post-COVID world, but also clearly Russia's invasion of Ukraine has fundamentally impacted the markets, and in particular the energy markets. Not everything that's happening in energy markets, though, can be laid at the blame of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but certainly there is fallout from that has had its impact. I'd argue that in a lot of respects is poor judgment, poor political leadership. How can you make decisions around energy when energy security of supply doesn't enter the debate is a really curious thing. I studied, after my mining, I studied mineral economics, and we did the economics of energy resources, and a fundamental part of that is energy security. So that ticked all the boxes for me joining up with this group and pushing forward to list this company. And we haven't disappointed. We've hit the ground running. We've moved forward. I'm learning a new environment because I haven't operated in the US, and that's exciting for me. And we're now just about to start our first drilling campaign, but that's not the only thing, because we've really nailed a whole host of really important deliverables in the first 5 odd months of our listing life.
You mentioned that your uranium deposit is well defined. But in terms of scale, where does it sit relative to other uranium deposits?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question, because often we get sidetracked by the monsters out there, and there are some massive uranium deposits. People often, like, oh, Australia has 1/3 or kind of an exact number of global uranium resources. Well, actually, yeah, but that's 95% tied up in one deposit, and that's Olympic Dam, which is not a uranium mine. It's a copper gold miner with a uranium byproduct, and a very cost-effective uranium byproduct, I might add. So, when you look at in the global scale of things, and you look at the Cigar Lakes of this world, high grade, small tonnage, very high grade, lots of uranium, that's not what we're about, and it's not what the Aurora uranium deposit is about. But what I hasten to add, so in the global scheme of things, in round figures, a 40 million pound deposit may not be seen to be particularly large. However, in the US context, that is a significant, in fact, it's one of the largest single uranium deposits in the US. And often I find, and this is not a criticism, it's just an observation, I find I see, uranium companies listed, whether in Australia or in Canada or in the US, quoting pounds on the balance sheet, but those pounds are made up of a disparate bunch of little pods of uranium that owe their existence to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And by the way, Aurora was discovered in the 1970s, so it's also been around for a long time. And they're in disparate states, etc. And I'm somewhat critical of those claims, because anything under 20 million pounds in a conventional resource will be very difficult to deliver in an environmentally responsible way. Now, in the US, for example, at peak production of uranium, which was around about 1980, 40, 44, something like that, million pounds per annum was their peak production. A lot of it incentivized from the early days of the 50s and the 60s. There was something like 350 little uranium mines. Dare I say it, rats and mice. They were substantial, large, credible operations, but there were these tiny little operations. And what that led to is a massive environmental liability. It's legacy issues that sit across the US. New Mexico comes to mind immediately, the Navajo, and the consequences that they've suffered from that sort of approach to mining. And that will never and can never be allowed to happen again. And that's why 40 million pounds is what we're really comfortable with, because that's the scale that you could enter production, you can produce for 10 to 15 years, 1.5 to 2 million pounds per annum comfortably. And that's where the utilities in the US that are desperate for domestic supply of uranium want to get on board, and they want to get involved, because they, hang on, this is somebody that can produce environmentally sustainable, non-legacy forming uranium mining, and it's the domestic supply chain. So it really is in that context that this is a very significant deposit in terms of scale in the US.
Obviously, you mentioned there's lithium at the site. Sorry. Does that pose some metallurgical challenges, having obviously both uranium and lithium to mine?
Yeah, it was one of the first things that crossed my mind, because I hadn't got across the geology at the time when I first got involved. But as it turns out, they are geologically discrete. And so you could elect to strip off the lithium and just mine the uranium, or you could mine the lithium and leave the uranium behind for a later date, or you could mine them both, but they would need to be treated by two different plants. So the only shared infrastructure would be the transportation mechanism from the mining operation to the plant. And I've got some great ideas as far as that's concerned, which we can perhaps touch on later on, because I don't envisage a trucking operation. This will be a low CO2 emissions, in low environmental footprint operation, but that's a slightly different topic. So what it means is, you would go in and you may strip the lithium overburden, lithium containing overburden from the uranium, which in areal extent is rather small compared to the overall area of the lithium hosting sediments. And you could stockpile that lithium hosted lake bed sediments and then mine the uranium. And all you want to do is you want to make sure that you do not sterilize other parts of the lithium deposit. And so the conceptual mine design that my predecessors at Aurora, which some of the same people that are still here today, had when they acquired the deposit from Uranium One back in 2010, this had to change because, you know, what made most sense at the time was a small plant at the mine site. We've changed all that so that we don't sterilize lithium. And in fact, we just recently bought a private piece of land just inside Nevada, which then speaks to this mine of the future idea that we have around conveying ore, you know, across the border into Nevada, where it's the ideal location environmentally to host both a plant and a tailings facility. So yeah, you would say you have the ability to stockpile the lithium whilst mining the uranium, or if lithium all of a sudden gets so big and it just absolutely dominates the atmosphere, the discussion, we can push the button on the lithium and park the uranium. That's not our intent, but that may ultimately be an outcome, you know. So just in terms of scale, you know, when I talk scale, let's talk aerial extent. The uranium deposit itself is about 1,600 meters long by about 350 meters wide, whereas the extent of the lithium is, you know, well over 3.5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. So a much larger area that we need to cover, and obviously that we need to explore to test those, you know, those lithium hosting sediments.
You just announced imminently the commencement of your first exploration drilling campaign since obviously listed in May. What's the objective of the campaign, and what can the market look forward to with obviously potential results?
Yeah, it's quite funny because you know, we rightly so we highlighted in the release some of the results that my predecessors at the company got with their 32-hole diamond drill program in 2011. And when you look at those results, you know, I think any uranium company, and literally any, even Cameco, would welcome those results as being really significant and attractive. You know, for example, you know, we had you know, shallow, wide intersections, you know, well over 25, 30, 40, 70 meters at, you know, 40, 400, 500, 600. I think there was even one intersection at 1,000 ppm. And generally, these are all close to surface, you know, 20, 30, 40 meters deep. So there were a couple of deep ones, admittedly, but a lot of them, you know, are significant high-grade intersections at reasonable depths. And then you add to that, but hang on a minute, but there's potentially payable lithium sitting in the shallow sediments above that as well. So, you know, this is the first time that the company's consciously gone ahead and said, okay, we're exploring both for lithium and uranium. Whereas the 2011 program was entirely focused on the uranium, and the lithium was a consequence of that, where they went back. In fact, that was, I think, our first release when just after we listed was we retrieved the stored core and we assayed the lithium in those sediments, and also got them, you know, encouraging results. They're in the same ballpark as our next door neighbor and fellow Aussie Jindalee, which is encouraging because they have the second largest lithium deposit in the US. You know, so well, if we can replicate their success, we'd be very happy on the lithium side as well. So we're looking to extend potentially the northern western hemisphere extension of the existing uranium deposit, whilst doing a wider program to test for the deeper, thicker lithium sediments that we believe are in existence to the northeastern part of the claim block, where there is a downthrow fault, and the sediments are up to 200 meters deep, which once again reflect those of both Jindalee as well as the Thacker Pass lithium deposit, which is America's largest, which is 25 km south of us. So there's lots of news flow to come around both uranium and lithium intersections, and obviously the assays. We're also permitting more drilling. These things do take time in Oregon, and it's a two-step process. You deal first with the feds in the Bureau of Land Management, and then you go to the state-based regulator. And so, we're already moving forward with the next phase of drilling. This was a pretty small drilling program, just to make sure that we understood the requirements of the regulators and that. And now we do. We're in a better position for the next tranche of applications for more permits.
Yeah. Obviously, you've worked around the world in Australia, Asia, Africa. What would you say the main differences is in working in the US and the mining legislation? You'd probably just cover a little bit there. What are the main differences that you see and you've experienced in terms of the way they mine, and I suppose the legislation as well? And obviously we've got audience from all around the world, so be interested to hear your thoughts.
Makes sense. Yes. Look, I think there are some similarities in dealing in Australia and the US, and I don't want to dumb down or simplify things too much. But both being first world jurisdictions, and I've permitted a uranium mine in South Australia at the federal, with Commonwealth level and the state level, a sensitive potash project in WA at the state level and at the Commonwealth level. So I'm attuned and used to dealing with regulatory bodies all over the world, as well as Namibia and Algeria and Mozambique and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, etc. So feed around. I love the can-do attitude of the US. There is an absolute belief that we can pull this off, and you see that with all the entrepreneurs that the US historically has bred over the last 50, 100, 120 years. So that gives me confidence in dealing that environment. In addition to that, I mentioned that Nevada property purchase, and people have asked, why not process in Oregon? So we're in a somewhat hilly part of the world. It's not, these are not mountains, they're gently undulating hills. But the reality is that location, Nevada, is ideal. But also, because like Australia, the US has different regulatory bodies on a state-by-state basis, we know that Nevada, depending on the year you select, is 1, 2, or 3 in the Fraser Institute Index of best places, best mining jurisdictions. And, so we thought, well, environmentally, that's a piece of land that ticks the box, but also here's a state that knows and understands mining intimately. And so to actually permit the processing plant in Nevada will make our lives not easy, but easier. So that's why we went down that path. So we're really attracted by that first world jurisdiction, the rule of law. Things aren't going to get confiscated, taken away from you, and there's a litany of that, obviously, in Africa that I've witnessed firsthand. So yeah, we're really looking forward and love operating in that environment. And of course, also, given we're operating sort of in Nevada and in Oregon, we're tapping into that knowledge base of mining and environmental consultants, etc., that operate throughout that region, that makes our lives easier as well.
I suppose let's talk about the status of nuclear power. What's happening within the space and obviously in the US, and could your project supply I suppose a substantial amount of uranium to the sector within the US?
Yeah, look, at last, the nuclear sector in the US is getting the recognition it deserves. For so long, so much money has been thrown at renewables and subsidized and to the disadvantage of nuclear, that they've actively, disadvantaged their largest, most reliable supply of clean energy is disappointing. And it's not just the US, most of the world has done that. And the Germans, beyond the pale in terms of what they've done, 450 billion euros on renewables and coal mining and gas, whilst turning off perfectly good nuclear reactors. And once again, forgetting about that whole energy security issue. So I'm encouraged by recent developments where it's not as if there are formal subsidies to nuclear, but they're recognizing nuclear energy's benefits as we recognize renewables benefits. And so, there is some price protection for those power stations, and that makes absolute sense. And so now that's bringing more confidence to the market. We've also got bipartisan support for the first time in over 40 years on nuclear between incumbent Democrats and the Republicans that are saying and recognizing we need this. And in fact, so much so that plants' lives are being extended. As recently was the one in of all places in California, which is great to see. And Gottlieb in, I'm forgetting, Virginia, I think, is being loaded as we speak and is about to start generating power. So the first new nuclear power station in 2.5 decades, I think, or something, in the US that's being loaded, and its brother or sister, depending on the right terminology, will follow in a few years or 18 months' time. So the first of the 2 new nuclear power reactors to get up and running, and that's just great news for power generation, clean energy power generation in the US. They still remain by far and away the largest producer of electricity from nuclear. Their demand would be in the order of 40 to 45 million pounds per annum. They've dropped from about 100 reactors to about 90 odd reactors, but still producing pretty much almost the same amount as the 100 reactors were, because they were smaller reactors. And every year they inch up incrementally and uprate these things. So the engineering is fantastic. And they're going for life extensions as well. So that's really important. And then you've got this, strategic uranium reserve fund, $1.5 billion, which has been established to encourage and source domestic supply of uranium. And then there's the massive, so the 6 billion was the number that was mentioned, I think, at the time of this price support for nuclear power. And then there's the hundreds of billions of dollars going into the Inflation Reduction Act, which is targeting, the critical mineral space. And I know technically in the US, uranium is no longer regarded as critical. That's just terminology. It is critical, clearly, for half of their clean energy production. So we're very well positioned and really have the tailwinds behind us as far as lithium and uranium is concerned. And we sincerely hope that we will one day be a significant longer-term supplier to both the nuclear fleet, but also to battery producers and EVs in the US as well.
Obviously, we talked about uranium within the US market. What about lithium? And do you see Aurora supplying the domestic US market with sufficient amount of lithium?
Yeah, so this form of lithium, so we're somewhat biased in WA because we wear this spodumene hat, and so we're all comfortable with the fact that we export a 5.5% concentrate, and think that that's a good idea. Of course, I'm not knocking it. It's a sound business, and you look at the success of WA lithium industry, it's fantastic. But it's not the only way to do things, as we know. Brian is out there as well. And the third leg of the lithium story for future security of supply is lithium hosted in similar clay-hosted lakebed sediments like we have. And so this geological region that we are located in, known as the McDermott caldera, has the potential to be the largest source of lithium in the world, let alone in North America. And has it been done before? Not on a large scale, but there has been decades worth of investment and research into producing lithium from clay hosting clay beds. And so you've got in Sonoma in Mexico, you've got Thacker Pass just down the road from us with Lithium Americas waiting for final approvals. And you've got Jindalee, and there are a number of others out there as well. So for us, we're not first movers, we are followers, and we only stand to learn from those other players. But those other players, Ganfeng acquired the Sonoma deposit in Mexico, so that gives it a huge tick of approval, clearly, because they're the world's largest. And Lithium America is one of the largest companies with significant offtakes for its product, ultimately when Thacker Pass comes into production. So I fundamentally see us as part of that story. And it's not just a Tesla story. People conveniently, and I acknowledge we do this too. We've got the Tesla factory in Reno, on our map. And sure, that's cool to show. And we often fly into Reno and have meetings with our consultants before driving up to McDermott. And so pretty much we drive past the Tesla factory every time we're in the US. And as I said, that is cool. But the product that you produce is not a 5.5% concentrate. It's carbonate or ultimately hydroxide. And obviously it's early stages for us to decide where we will be. I noticed, for example, that Jindalee announced that they're even looking at LFP, which is fascinating to me, because that's something we hadn't considered. So, acknowledgement to Jindalee and their lateral thinking. And that's a very, as we know, very high value product, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a ton. And that's something that can travel enormous distances. And so it's not, we've got to chase Tesla, because you've got all these gigafactories on the East Coast that are springing up everywhere, LG and all these other players, Ford, VW, Honda, they're all there. And so we definitely see it as part of the US domestic chain. But who we ultimately supply, obviously the jury will remain out for quite a long time still to come.
Yes, certainly. The Biden administration has passed a number of acts that seem to obviously be supportive of minerals. You're obviously aiming to produce. So do you think you're able to sort of take advantage of the legislation that's been obviously put out there?
Yeah, look, I think, having had the benefit of, for example, our own Australian, research grants, etc., and I've tapped into those credibly as well, and they facilitate some amazing work, metallurgical research work and everything. So I'm a huge believer that cautiously invested taxpayer money actually does make sense. Sometimes they bet too big and they get it wrong. And I could point to 4 or 5 recent investments in WA, but I won't mention any names and I won't mention the mineral, that are fraught with danger and are going to cost taxpayers and have already cost taxpayers inordinate amounts of money. But this is something that is driving the US because they realize they are so far behind the 8 ball when it comes to this. It's like, wow, we have been asleep at the wheel thinking, she'd be right, mate, we'll always be able to get our stuff, in inverted commas, from elsewhere. And now it's, and I saw somebody's comment the other day, it's no longer NIMBY, not in my backyard, it's now BIMBY. It's beautiful in my backyard. Now, there is still an environmental backlash, and community, are concerned about mining on their back doorstep, but they recognize the absolute need to bring that domestic production home. And so you have companies like Ioneer that have done a fantastic job with their Rhyolite Ridge lithium boron project. And, they already are in the process with due diligence being done on their project, which could attract huge funding, state funding, to get that project up and running. As is Thacker Pass. Thacker Pass, more than half of that will be funded by government incentives. And Piedmont Lithium just the other day got I can't remember the exact number, but a significant grant for a facility. So there are things that we need to learn about how we go about tapping into those opportunities. But absolutely, I do believe that we will be part of that, and will benefit, and our shareholders ultimately will also benefit, as will the country, from those grants and from that research.
Yeah, I've got a couple more questions. You mentioned, obviously, trucking, logistics, obviously of uranium and lithium. You mentioned it earlier on. What were your thoughts around that? I wonder if you could just provide a little bit more information, because I take it there was something there that you wanted to get out and you're going to wait till a bit later on.
Thanks for coming back to that. I appreciate picking up on that, because I'm also genuinely excited about this. Throughout my career, I've been known as somebody who does think outside the box and done some interesting stuff. And this in particular, I'm really enthusiastic about. So, when we started thinking about, an ideal location for a plant away from the deposit itself, it forces you to think about logistics and logistics solutions. And we know as a fact that, Oregon is well over 50% hydro and has fairly deep penetration of renewables as well. So, it's a clean energy supply system in Oregon. And it just so happens that we have a major power line coming down from the Harney co-op, electricity co-op, pretty much on our doorstep. And, so we are able to tap into hydro-generated clean electricity. Wait for this number. This will bring many people, I think, in Australian mining to tears. 6.5 US cents per kilowatt hour is the average price of to industrial consumers of electricity this year to date. So that's a current. That's not going back 5 years. That's current. And last year it averaged around about that number. So number one, it's cost effective. Number two, hey, it's clean. It's zero emissions. So that then prompts you to think about, all right, well, who needs to truck? Who needs to build roads? You just select a suitable conveying mechanism, be it a sophisticated conveyor belt or a pipeline, and you run the ore like that across the 12 Ks straight into Nevada. And so your local community isn't impacted by that transportation source. It just operates quietly in the background and does its thing. And they can quite happily, as can wildlife, etc., operate in that environment. And the only thing is the mine site development, and off mine site, the plant site development, which, as I say, has a sealed road and a power line going over the top of it. So existing infrastructure, and so you have this. A number of consulting companies talk about this mine of the future concept, where it's minimal trucking. You may end up trucking if there is waste, trucking that a K or so to where you've got your waste dump. But apart from that, it's input crusher onto a conveyor or into a pipeline and across into the plant, and there you go. And that is so much better than trucking miles and miles and miles. Your energy efficiency, your carbon footprint, everything. Just you can then realistically say, how do we get to zero, to a zero carbon emissions footprint? And it's just by just good fortune of Oregon's hydroelectricity position, we can tap into that. And so there's a huge benefit of being in Oregon, just for that reason alone. Where people say, oh, Oregon's not a mining state. Well, it's got a lot of things going for it, and that's one of the examples.
And lastly, just wondering if you can give us a outlook of what's the next 6 to 9 months looking like for Aurora, and also just any final thoughts you want to share with our audience around uranium, around lithium, around Aurora, whatever you want your final thoughts may be.
Yeah. All right. No, thanks, Rob. Yeah. Look, I think, I think I know we're going to be pretty busy for the next, right through to the end of next year and beyond. And this drilling campaign, given that it's RC only, is the first of many holes to be drilled. which will be both RC and diamond drill ultimately. And diamond, in order to generate core in the first instance for I would say final stages of metallurgical test work before a pre-feasibility study. So the milestones and the news flow to look for would be the minute we start drilling next week is, obviously when it comes to uranium, we'd be using a geophysical tool, a gamma tool, it's called gamma, to get an E reading of the uranium. But then ultimately that needs to be backed up by assays. Assay waiting time in Nevada is typically at the moment around 2 months, if you're lucky, maybe slightly longer. So, we'll be consistently announcing progress on the drilling program, progress with our ongoing permitting for the next phases of metallurgical test work, as well as conceiving what's called a plan of operations, which is an exploration plan of operations, which enables us to up the ante with regards to the amount of disturbance we allow to create at the project site. At the moment, without that, we're limited to a maximum of 5 acres of disturbance. So that's a very important piece of work that takes well over a year to finish. And we're looking to try and commence this year. And that in itself will be noteworthy and newsworthy, but then doing the surveys, etc., throughout the year before delivering that report to the BLMs at some time, maybe at the end of next year. And then out of that also flows metallurgical test work and those results feeding into a feasibility study. The lithium will obviously lag that. So with lithium, it's around CITA tests. It's understanding the mineralogy of the clay mineral that the lithium is hosted in, and then starting the metallurgical test work program. So plenty of things to keep us busy and keep the market informed. Look, I think from both a nuclear and uranium point of view, I only see tailwinds, because of this recognition in Europe and in the US and in many other countries. And people were quick to point out the amount of coal China burns, but they're less quick to point out their commitment to renewables and their commitment to nuclear. It's huge, and so that's really important from the overall uranium market perspective. But it's not just about those countries. You look at the UAE, which started just over 12 years ago from scratch and has already commissioned its 3rd reactor with the 4th on the way. That's a magnificent success story for what can be achieved in nuclear. And the naysayers are the people that blithely say it costs too much. Well, that's because they don't differentiate or understand the difference between capital and operating costs, and the fact that you need to replace turbines and solar panels every 15 or 20 years. They complain about the waste when they never mention where the world's EVs, EV batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines, where's that waste going? All that is taken account for in the nuclear chain. We can't produce an ounce or a milliwatt of electricity without every part of the chain being spoken for, including looking after the waste. So, which is a small problem. I mean, I was reading something the other day. All the nuclear spent fuel in the US, 50 years, in fact, 70 years, 1950s, would fill a football stadium 10 meters deep. So that's the volumetric challenge. And then people, but it's there for 40,000 years. Well, actually, that's also not a credible criticism because the radioactivity drops at exponential rate. And so it's perfectly handleable very quickly. And we have all those technical solutions. So it's unfortunate that the sector's been blindsided by these naysayers who, have had their day in the sun, dare I say it. I shouldn't have, because don't get me wrong, renewables absolutely have their role to play. So that this is not an anti-renewable statement at all, but it's just that we need everything. We need everything to be success in future and to address this, what I said at the beginning, before we went online, or right at the start, this structural change in how we do energy for the future and for the planet, you know. So really excited about that acknowledgement. Saddened that it's taken this long to get there, and you know, but it's great. And similarly with lithium, you know, what a wonderful story that, you know, at last, after, you know, people have aspired to build, you know, electric vehicles, that now they are being built and powered by lithium batteries, and they are the most exciting cars you can drive. It's fantastic, and I'm really enthusiastic about that as well, and how in our small way we can contribute to that transition. And you know, that's what keeps me up at night, but gets me going in the morning as well.
Yeah, certainly. Greg, really appreciate your time in sharing your experience and your wisdom, especially in obviously the uranium space, and telling us a little bit more about what Aurora are up to. So if our audience wants to reach out to you, just wondered how they can go about doing that. Are you across any social media platforms? As I mentioned, you're going to be at the Mines and Money event at the end of November, which is 2022. So obviously people can arrange to catch up with you then.
Yeah, look, we're at the normal info at auroraenergymetals.com. If you want to reach out to me directly, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter feed as well as 1AE and Aurora. Yeah, so looking forward to Mines and Money. And London, I actually recently won the pitch battle of the online version of Mines and Money. So that was pretty cool that Aurora, you know, beat out a couple of competitors with different offerings. People recognized, you know, the potential of the project, and the location we're in, and the industries that we're in as well. So that was nice encouragement from an independent panel of investors as well. Hope to maybe do the same when I'm in London as well, because we'll be participating in the pitch battle at Mines and Money too.
Yeah, no, and it'd be good to catch up there as well. And obviously, our listeners, no doubt, will be attending. So obviously, feel free to reach out to Greg and meet up with him. And if you've obviously got any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to him. The information will be in the show notes accompanying this podcast. So, Greg, really appreciate your time. And listeners, hope you enjoyed this episode. There's some education obviously around the uranium space here. Greg is obviously an expert in the industry, having worked for some of the bigger companies out there, and worked on some of the various deposits around the world. So Greg is obviously has a wealth of information and knowledge around the uranium space. So please take advantage of reaching out to him if you have any questions. So until next time, happy mining.
Yes.